You know, it was always a risk for Labor leader Anthony Albanese to make Kristina Keneally Labor's spokesman for Home Affairs, which means talking about really serious things like national security and boat people and those issues that Labor's been so weak on for years, disastrously weak. And Labor really needed someone strong here. Keneally, though, well, last month, for instance, she said that the Prime Minister should act like the Christian he is and let a family of Sri Lankan illegal immigrants stay here, despite every court in the land virtually having said, you've got to go. And she said that despite it actually contradicting what seemed to be Labor's policy. And yesterday she said the government should bring back to Australia about 20 wives of Australian Islamic State terrorists who are now stuck in a refugee camp in Syria with their 44 children.
The 40 or so Australian children or children who have a claim to Australian citizenship are indeed innocent victims.
And it wasn't a mistake, I think, because Keneally doubled down on that today.
The question now before the government is whether it is safe to extract them. I agree with the Prime Minister that they are innocent victims, and I would encourage the government to consider the options that are before it.
But not only, you know, there were actually members of Keneally's own side who are not buying what I think is actually a sexist claim that the women who joined the Islamic State were simply victims, innocent victims of their husbands wanting to go and fight. Here is Labor's Anne Ali, who's got a background in de-radicalising extremists.
A lot of people think that there's this trope of the jihadi bride, that she was convinced to go there, and that's the case for some of them, but others had a very strong participatory role.
Joining me is the panel, Michael Kroger, former Victorian Liberal President, and Michael Costa, former New South Wales Labor Treasurer. Michael Costa, what exactly is Keneally doing to Labor?
Well, who knows? Who can explain it? But look, Anthony Albanese has got a major problem on his hand, not only with Keneally, but some of his other appointments. I mean, what we were promised after the surprise election defeat would be a pivot to more centre-based policies. We're seeing a continuation of the very policies that caused Labor to lose what should have been an unlosable election for them. And, you know, Keneally's probably the prime example of this, but you can look across the board. I mean, we remember Richard Miles' comments about China. Penny Wong's made some silly comments, or foreshadowing some silly comments she's going to make, and it goes on. Even in the Treasury area, you know, the attempt to rationalise some of the silly economic policies, and on climate change, absolutely no change. Absolutely no change. So you can see Labor's in disarray at the moment, and clearly, if you're the government, you'd be very pleased with what you're seeing.
No, I couldn't agree more with that. And now Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton said, you know, this was a dangerous suggestion, that we're going to be maybe bringing people back who know how to make bombs and all that kind of stuff. Is that going over the top?
Not at all. I mean, he's got 2 years under the foreign fighters legislation to assess these applicants. But the Security Intelligence Service has already said to Peter Dutton that there are people there that they've got to be very careful of. So is Dutton doing the right thing? He's 100% correct.
So what's Keneally doing
Well, as Michael Costa has said, Keneally is a big problem for the Labor Party. I mean, rather than leave the government alone on issues where the government has a commanding lead over Labor, she's picking a fight on an issue which is Labor want to bring home the ISIS brides and their children straight away. Peter Dutton says that's not a good idea. Take a poll amongst the public and see who's winning there. And as Michael correctly says, you know, you saw the right of the Labor Party on the weekend arguing that they've got to come back to the sensible centre, and here's Keneally way out there in this extreme position doing immense damage to Labor. This is crazy, and Albanese at the first opportunity has got to move her or imminently silence her.
Yeah, Michael Costa, you know, I want to pick up on a point that you both have made. I mean, here are Labor front benches seeming to go out of the way to pick fights with governments precisely in the areas where Labor is weak, and that is the borders, you know, controlling the Islamic State, people wanting to come back. We see it with China policy, with Richard Marles saying we've got to get closer to China, and including military exercises. Penny Wong today giving a speech criticising the government on this. I mean, why pick a fight on the weak points instead of emphasising where Labor's strong?
Because they're in disarray, policy disarray, Andrew. I mean, the fact of the matter is they're circling the wagons around what they feel comfortable in, and they haven't done what they said they were going to do after the election loss, and that is review all their policies. And it's pretty hard to review your policies when one of your major branches, the New South Wales branch, is in political and organisational disarray. So I think Labor's in serious trouble. Anthony Albanese has really been quite absent in his leadership role. He needs to stand up. He needs to fill that vacuum himself and put some sensible direction for the Labor Party, or they're going to lose. I mean, Penny Wong's comments are just extraordinary. She's running this proposition, if you believe what she's going to say, the reports of what she's going to say.
She said it already today, I think, at lunchtime.
Oh, did she? Well, it's absurd. If she said that free trade and globalisation are synonymous, firstly, she doesn't understand her economic history. I mean, the golden age of globalisation in the 19th century, there were no global free trade, I should say, in the 19th century. There were no global institutions of the forms they're talking about. People are reacting against globalism across the board, especially in Western democracies, and she's running a very seriously flawed argument that misses the point about people's concerns about globalisation, yet at the same time people can support the proposition that free trade is in mutual interest of both parties. So, you know, I'd
like her to try her line out on blue-collar workers, Labor voters in factories and industries that have been shut down by a little bit of free trade. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have been shut down, but I'm saying try and argue that as a Labor front bencher. Now, by the way, though, Michael Kroger, the government had its own mini embarrassment today. It accidentally handed to journalists 12 pages of the speaking notes that it sends to all MPs about issues of the day that might come up, and this is what you got to say, this is the background. Anything about this? I mean, the embarrassment itself, I think, is just the Beltway issue. No concern to voters. Anything about that list that struck you?
Nope.
I am struck by the fact that one of the questions that they wanted MPs to prep on was still about Gladys Liu.
I thought you might.
Yeah. Well, what do you make of that? Why? Gladys Liu, they've hidden her under a rock about her links to China, which are strong, with China's formal propaganda outfit, and they're still prepping MPs to deal with questions about that, which is interesting.
Yeah, because there'd been a development over the last couple of weeks, which was that she'd looked into her association with, hundreds and hundreds of organisations. So what you do in those notes is you update a whole lot of the backbenchers with what's happened. But let me tell you this, in two and a half years' time, no one will remember, not a single Australian will remember or be influenced by the leak of these notes.
No, I'm
and
not saying that.
Everyone will remember that Christina Keneally said, bring the ISIS brides home.
Nice pivot.
No. Everyone will remember that. And that's the important thing. A lot of the things that are happening, by the way, in Labor today, he said, she said, none of that stuff, they're finding their feet, as we did after 07. None of this stuff will be relevant 2.5 years to be fair to Labor. But these extreme elements within Labor, like what Keneally has been saying...
Because they've got to be dealt with.
Exactly right.
They've got to be dealt with.
People will not forget it. Michael
Costa, anything struck you about the list of questions and answers, the 12 pages?
Andrew, look, I mean, firstly, let's deal with the issue. I mean, this is what governments and oppositions do anyhow, having talking points. I think they were just preparing. I think they were preparing for question time. And that makes a lot of sense.
I don't doubt that. But I'm just thinking the issues that they thought were sellers, like, or problems like Gladys Liu. I think they have not dealt with Gladys Liu. They've hidden her under a rock for weeks, and they're still having to field questions about her.
In terms of politics, and I'm not talking, and I agree with Michael Kroger, the broader electorate doesn't care, but in terms of politics, I think it is an issue for Labor to pursue, and they'll continue to pursue it as you would if you see an opportunity. But the problem for Labor there, of course, is its own vulnerability on China, which we've already discussed. I mean, they have greater vulnerability, and you've got to wonder, if I was a tactician, about looking at the balance sheet of my vulnerability versus the other side. And at the moment, I think it lies with Labor in terms of its deficiencies and potential negatives.
Oh, look, I think Labor's in a world of pain, and Anthony Albanese, I think he caught the car and is struggling to find where to drive it, and
Absolutely.
I think that's a real problem. Greg Craven, I think you know him well, yeah? He was fantastic on ABC Radio last night or the night before, having a go at Gillian Triggs. Well done, Greg. I should have sent you a herogram. Greg Craven, Vice-Chancellor of the Australian Catholic University, has called for universities to encourage more teaching of Australian culture, literature, arts, history, politics, instead of, offering students a more international sort of diet, which universities seem to be doing more because so many of their students come from overseas. What do you make of this call?
Well, a great call by Greg Craven, as you would expect from him and the ACU. But isn't it awful, Andrew, that in our country today, people are not prepared to talk up Australian values, the Australian history, the greatness of this country, all that's been achieved over hundreds of years, hey?
Cultural cringe.
Cultural cringe. I mean, this is one of the great nations of the world. We are an extraordinary success story over the generations, and the fact that schools in particular and universities wanted to cry or ignore a history is appalling, and it shows an incredible... people have written about this over the years, a collapse of confidence in Western democracies, that people are not prepared to do this. So all strength to Greg Craven's arm, and good on him for saying so.
Michael Costa?
Oh, look, I agree, but I think the problem he misses the point. I'm also concerned about what they actually teach in the courses that exist. All the revisionism that's going on is worse than the teaching of it. I'd rather they not teach it than teach revisionist history, which is what we're seeing more and more in these Australian history courses. And, and we're seeing it certainly in the primary schools and the high schools. And that's the real worry. You've got to teach something that's relatively objective and reject the sort of relativism of the sort of postmodern historians.
Yeah, Michael Costa makes a good point. In some senses, I think, well, if you're going to teach Australian history like that, better not teach it at all. There's a tale of endless massacres and oppression and shocking and racism, which doesn't explain why Australia has turned out to be such a liberal, attractive country, attracting migrants from all around the world, including my own parents. You kind of think least said, soonest mended.
Look, all of the above, but the other thing that worries me is that you see the left in Australian politics decry our flag. The fact that the Australian flag is waved, and there's a group in our society that thinks somehow that's racist, that you can't fly the Australian flag, that's how bad things have got in parts of this country. I mean, we should be proud of everything this great nation has achieved. And, Geoffrey Blaney wrote about these things in The Tyranny of Distance. He wrote about Mile Creek and, the great history that Blaney wrote. That hasn't changed. And Australia, things happen in the past.
Yes, but what people don't recognise about Mile Creek is that it was a marvellous example. All right, involved hanging a lot of white guys. Hanging is not so good. But that the law applied to everyone alike, and white men paid for their lives for killing a black one. So that was, I thought, was fantastic. Well, a good example at any rate. Michael Costa, Michael Kroger, thank you both so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.